What happens when a desperate woman with nothing to lose asks a dangerous man with everything to hide to marry her? This old Western love story will break your heart and heal it. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in the dusty town of Copper Springs, and Eleanor Whitmore clutched her worn leather bag against her chest like it contained her entire world. In many ways it did. She had traveled 17 days from Boston, carrying nothing but 2 dresses, her mother's silver locket, and a letter that had promised her a new beginning. But as she stepped onto the wooden platform and looked around at the faces staring back at her, she realized that the man who had written those beautiful words was nowhere to be seen. The station master checked his pocket watch and shook his head. "You waiting for someone, miss?" he asked, though his eyes said he already knew the answer. "Mr. Harold Bennett," she replied, her voice smaller than she intended. "He was supposed to meet me here. We are to be married." A heavy silence fell over the small crowd gathered near the station. Women exchanged glances, and men suddenly found their boots very interesting. The station master cleared his throat and looked away. "Miss, I hate to be the one to tell you this," he said slowly, "but Harold Bennett passed on 3 weeks ago. Horse threw him coming back from the saloon. He did not survive the night." The world tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. She grabbed the wooden post beside her to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. Dead. The man who had promised her safety, a home, an escape from the factory work that had stolen her youth, and the cruel aunt who had made her life unbearable, was dead. And she was standing in a town where she knew no one, with exactly $4 to her name. "Is there somewhere I can stay?" she managed to ask, her voice breaking. "Just until I can figure out what to do." The station master scratched his beard uncomfortably. "The boarding house might take you for a few nights, but Mrs. Fugsaw Patterson is particular about her guests." And without money or prospects, he trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Eleanor spent that first night in the boarding house, crying into a pillow that smelled of dust and strangers. By morning, she had made a decision. She would not go back to Boston. She could not go back to the 18-hour shifts in the textile mill, to hands that bled from the machinery, to an aunt who reminded her daily that she was nothing but a burden. She would find another way. For 3 days, she walked the streets of Copper Springs, asking at every establishment if they needed help. The general store had no openings. The restaurant had hired someone just last week. The schoolhouse already had a teacher. Each rejection carved another piece of hope from her heart. On the 4th day, Mrs. Patterson informed her that she could no longer extend credit, and Eleanor would need to leave by morning. That evening, Eleanor sat on a bench outside the general store, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The tears she had been holding back all day finally escaped, rolling silently down her cheeks. "You are the mail-order bride," a deep voice said from somewhere to her left. The one Bennett sent for. Eleanor quickly wiped her face and looked up. The man standing before her was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone, giving his already stern face an intimidating edge. He wore a black hat pulled low, and a gun belt hung at his hip. Everything about him radiated danger. "I was," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I suppose news travels fast in a small town." "It does." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What will you do now?" "I do not know," she admitted. "I have no money, no family, and apparently no prospects. But I will figure something out. I always do." Something flickered in those gray eyes, something that might have been respect or might have been pity. Before she could decide which, he nodded once and walked away, his boots making heavy sounds against the wooden boardwalk. Who was that? Eleanor asked the woman sweeping the porch of the dress shop nearby. The woman's eyes widened. You do not know? That is Samuel Blackwood. Most folks just call him Blackwood, and they try not to call him anything at all if they can help it. He owns the biggest ranch outside of town, inherited it from his father, but he is not like other ranchers. She lowered her voice. They say he killed 3 men in a gunfight down in Texas. They say he does not feel anything, not happiness, not fear, not love. They say his own mother died of a broken heart because he was so cold. Eleanor looked in the direction Samuel Blackwood had disappeared. That sounds like a lot of things people say without knowing. The woman shrugged. Maybe, but I would stay away from him if I were you. Nothing good comes from getting close to a man like that. But Eleanor could not stop thinking about him. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something beneath the hard exterior that reminded her of a wounded animal, trying to appear strong. She recognized it because she saw the same thing in her own mirror every morning. The next day, with her belongings packed and nowhere to go, Eleanor made the most desperate decision of her life. She asked the station master where Samuel Blackwood's ranch was located, and she walked the 4 miles in her worn-out shoes, dust coating her dress and sweat dampening her hair. The ranch was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. Rolling hills stretched toward the mountains, and cattle dotted the landscape like scattered seeds. The main house was large, but neglected, its paint peeling, and its garden overgrown. As Eleanor approached, she saw him working on a fence, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, his movements efficient and solitary. He noticed her when she was still 50 feet away. He straightened slowly, hammer in hand, and watched her approach with those unnerving gray eyes. Miss Whitmore, he said when she stopped a few feet from him. It was not a question. Mr. Blackwood. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. I have a proposition for you. His eyebrow raised, the one with the scar, giving him an almost sardonic look. I am not in the habit of hearing propositions from strangers. Then let me be brief. Eleanor clasped her hands together to stop them from trembling. I need a husband. You need. She looked around at the neglected property, at the house that clearly had not felt a woman's touch in years. You need someone to take care of this place, to cook, to clean, to make it a home again. I am offering you a business arrangement. Marriage, in name, with all the practical benefits and none of the complications. For a long moment he simply stared at her. Then, to her complete surprise, he laughed. It was a rusty sound, like something that had not been used in a very long time. You are either very brave or very foolish, he said. Do you know what people say about me? I know what they say. I do not know if any of it is true. Some of it is. He set down the hammer and took a step closer to her. I have killed men, Miss Whitmore. I have done things that would give you nightmares. I am not a gentleman, and I am not a kind one. Whatever you are imagining, I am worse. Eleanor held her ground, even though every instinct told her to run. I am not asking you to be gentle or kind. I am asking you to give me a roof over my head and a chance to earn my keep. In return, you get a wife who will work hard and ask nothing of you but basic decency. And what happens when you realize you have made a mistake? When you cannot stand another day in this house with a man everyone fears? Then I suppose we will cross that bridge when we come to it. She lifted her chin. Please, Mr. Blackwood, please marry me. I have nowhere else to go, and no one else to ask. I am not too proud to beg if that is what it takes. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. He looked at her for a long time, really looked at her, and she felt as though he was seeing past her desperation to something deeper. You would marry a monster to escape your circumstances? He asked quietly. You are not a monster, she replied with a certainty. She did not fully understand. Monsters do not stop to ask strangers if they have somewhere to go. Monsters do not look sad when they think no one is watching. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind rustling through the grass and cattle lowing in the distance. Then Samuel Blackwood did something that shocked them both. All right, he said, I will marry you. They were wed 3 days later in a small ceremony at the church, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Eleanor wore her better dress, the blue one that brought out the color of her eyes, and Samuel wore a clean shirt that made him look almost respectable. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel brushed his lips against her forehead in a kiss so gentle it made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. The first weeks were awkward and strange. They moved around each other like dancers who did not know the steps. Polite, but distant. Samuel worked from dawn until dusk, coming inside only for meals that Eleanor prepared with growing confidence. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing away years of neglect. She planted flowers in the window boxes and hung curtains in the windows. Slowly, the house began to feel like a home. But it was the nights that changed everything. Each evening, after dinner, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set. At first, they sat in silence. Then, gradually, they began to talk. Samuel told her about his father, a cruel man who had beaten him for showing any weakness. He told her about the gunfight in Texas. How he had killed those men to protect a family they were threatening to harm. How the guilt still haunted him, even though he knew he had done the right thing. He told her about his mother, who had indeed died of a broken heart, but not because of him. Because his father had crushed every bit of love and joy out of her until there was nothing left. In return, Eleanor shared her own story, the parents who had died when she was 12, leaving her to the mercy of an aunt who saw her as nothing but free labor. The years of working in the factory, of going to bed hungry and waking up exhausted. The desperate hope that had driven her to answer Harold Bennett's advertisement, and the devastation of arriving to find that hope shattered. We are both broken, Samuel said one night, his voice rough with emotion. Maybe that is why this works. We understand each other's cracks. Eleanor reached over and took his hand, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since their wedding. Maybe broken people are the only ones who know how to put each other back together. The seasons changed, and with them, so did their relationship. What had begun as a business arrangement slowly transformed into something deeper. Eleanor found herself looking forward to Samuel's return each evening, found herself missing him when he was out on the range. She noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way his hand lingered on hers when she passed him his coffee. One evening, nearly 6 months after their wedding, Samuel came home with wildflowers clutched awkwardly in his large hand. His face was red, and he could not quite meet her eyes. I saw these by the creek, he mumbled. They reminded me of you. I do not know why. This was foolish. Eleanor took the flowers with trembling hands. They were simple things, purple and yellow blooms, that grew wild all over the valley, but they were the most beautiful gift she had ever received. Samuel, she said, and her voice cracked on his name. I need to tell you something. He finally looked at her, and she saw fear in his eyes. Real, genuine fear. If you want to leave, I understand. I have always known this day would come. I am not an easy man to love, and you deserve better. Then, she silenced him the only way she could think of. She stood on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. For a moment, he was frozen, too shocked to respond. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he kissed her back with all the passion and tenderness of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was unworthy of love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. Eleanor, he whispered, I have been falling in love with you since the day you walked up to my fence and asked me to marry you. I have been too afraid to say it, too afraid that speaking the words out loud would somehow break the spell, and you would disappear. I am not going anywhere, she promised. I love you, Samuel Blackwood, not despite who you are, but because of it. You are the strongest, most honorable man I have ever known, and I thank God every day that Harold Bennett's horse threw him, because it brought me to you. He laughed at that, a full, genuine laugh that transformed his entire face. That might be the most morbid declaration of love in history. Then it fits us perfectly, she replied. That night, for the first time, Eleanor shared Samuel's bed as his true wife. And in the morning, when she woke in his arms to the sound of birds singing outside their window, she knew that she had finally found the home she had been searching for her entire life. The town of Copper Springs was shocked by the change in Samuel Blackwood. The man who had once walked the streets with his head down and his eyes cold now smiled at shopkeepers and tipped his hat to ladies. He began helping his neighbors with their fences and their cattle, asking nothing in return. People whispered that it was witchcraft, that the mail-order bride had cast some spell on the most feared man in the territory. But those who looked closely could see the truth. It was not magic, it was love. A year after their wedding, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. Samuel held the tiny bundle in his arms, with tears streaming down his scarred face, and Eleanor had never loved him more than in that moment. I do not deserve this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I do not deserve either of you. Eleanor reached up and touched his cheek. That is not for you to decide. The people who love us get to decide what we deserve. And I have decided that you deserve everything. They named the baby Hope because that was what she represented. The hope that broken people could be healed. The hope that even the most feared man could learn to be gentle. The hope that love could find you in the most unexpected places, if only you were brave enough to ask for it. Years later, when the heir daughter was grown, and the ranch was thriving, and Samuel's hair had turned silver at the temples, Eleanor would still sometimes look at her husband and marvel at how her life had changed. She had come to Copper Springs, expecting nothing and asking for everything. She had begged the most feared cowboy in town to marry her, and in doing so, she had found a love story greater than anything she could have imagined. And on quiet evenings, when they sat on the porch watching the sunset, just like they had done all those years ago, Samuel would take her hand and tell her that she had saved his life, that he had been existing, not living, until she came along, that her courage had given him permission to feel again, to hope again, to love again. You changed everything, he would say. You changed me. And Eleanor would smile and lean her head against his shoulder. grateful for a stagecoach that had brought her to a dusty town in the middle of nowhere, and for a desperate proposal that had led her to the love of her life. Because sometimes, the best love stories do not begin with romance or attraction. Sometimes, they begin with two broken people who find the courage to say, please, and the grace to say yes.